I sent her all the emails at once, every single one, 3 years of them, in a single catastrophic moment on a Tuesday afternoon in November, sent with the specific finality of something that cannot be undone by the time you understand what you have done. I was trying to forward one email to a colleague. I selected the wrong folder. I selected all. I hit forward. I realized my mistake approximately 4 seconds after the send button, which is 4 seconds too late, which is the only margin that matters in this situation. I sat at my desk looking at the sent folder and the number in it, which was 211, and I thought, this is it. This is the specific catastrophe I have apparently been building toward for 3 years, without knowing that building toward a catastrophe was what I was doing. Her name is Celine. She is 34 years old, and she is an architect who runs her own small practice and who had been, until Tuesday afternoon in November, entirely unaware that I had been writing her emails for 3 years and not sending any of them. We had worked together on a project 28 months before the send, which is how I knew her, and we had parted at the end of the project with the kind of warmth that leaves a door open without either party specifying that the door is open, and I had spent the subsequent 28 months thinking about her more than was either useful or proportionate, and channeling that thinking into emails that I wrote and did not send for reasons I had organized into a coherent internal argument that included being uncertain whether she would want to hear from me, whether what I felt was real or was the residue of a professional intimacy that does not survive the end of the project that created it, and whether the gap between us in terms of what I wanted to say and what I could actually say was one that email could bridge. None of these reasons were bad reasons. They were simply reasons I had used to avoid saying anything, and on a Tuesday afternoon in November, the avoiding became impossible. I want to tell you what was in the emails before I tell you what happened after the send, because the emails are the whole story, and the send is only the crisis the story was driving toward. The first email was written 11 days after the project ended. I was sitting at my desk in the office we had shared for 4 months, which was now only the office I sat in because she had gone back to her practice, and I had opened a new email, typed her address, and written, I think the building is going to be very good. Not a love letter, not even a significant piece of communication. Just a thought I had about the project we had both worked on, a thought I wanted to share with the person who would most understand it, written to the person it was about, and then not sent, because by the time I finished typing it, I had thought about what sending it would mean and decided I wasn't sure. That email lived in a folder labeled Working for 28 Months. By the third month, the emails had changed in character. They were no longer about the building, which had by then reached a stage of construction that made it increasingly obvious that yes, it was going to be very good, which had become something I thought about in relation to her and the specific quality of attention she brought to a problem, and the way she talked about the relationship between a space and the people who would inhabit it, which was a way of talking about buildings that was also, I had come to understand, a way of talking about how she thought about most things. The emails in the third and fourth months were about things I had noticed and wanted to tell her. A bridge in the financial district that had been repaired in a way that preserved the original rivet pattern, which she had mentioned once as something she wished was more common. A book I had read that made a specific argument about the relationship between infrastructure and memory that I thought she would argue with productively. A photograph I had taken of the building at a stage of construction that would never look the same way again, which I had saved thinking she might want it and had then not sent. All of these things went into the working folder addressed to her email address, and none of them left the folder, and the folder grew. I am 36 years old. I work in urban planning for the city, which is how I had ended up on the project where I met her. As the city liaison for a development that required someone who understood both the regulatory landscape and the architectural vision, neither of which is a role most people would describe as romantic, but which, in that 4 months, had been the most engaged I had been in any professional context in years, partly because the project was genuinely interesting and partly because of who I was working alongside. She had a way of looking at a problem that started from the outside of it, from the street level and the sky and the existing grain of the neighborhood, and worked inward, which produced a specific quality of building that was responsive to its context in a way that most buildings were not. I found this compelling in the way I found most things compelling when she did them, which was more compelling than when other people did them, which was a sign I chose, for the 4 months of the project, not to examine too closely. By the end of the first year, the emails were longer. The earlier ones had been 2 or 3 paragraphs, practical and observational, things that were easy to imagine actually sending. The year 1 emails were harder to imagine sending, not because they were dramatic, but because they had become honest in a way that required a recipient, and the recipient they required was her. I had written, in month 10, an email that described what I had been thinking about for the previous 10 months, which was that the project had been the beginning of something I had not known how to continue, and that the something had been the quality of attention she had made possible by paying it herself, and that I was aware that this was not information she had asked for, and that I was not sending it, but that the not sending had started to feel like its own form of dishonesty, and that I was writing it down because writing it down felt more honest than either sending it or simply thinking it. That email was 340 words. It went into the folder addressed to her email address and did not move. In the second year, the pattern changed slightly. I had started, somewhere in month 14, to also write responses to things that had not been said to me. She had been quoted in a magazine article about adaptive reuse, which I had read 3 times and about which I had written a 2-page response that I had addressed to her and not sent. She had completed a project that had been written about briefly in an architectural journal, which I had read and responded to in an email that contained 3 paragraphs about the specific quality of the light in the photographs, and what I thought it was doing that the photographs could not have been planned to do. She did not know I was reading these things. She did not know the responses existed. They were in a folder that was addressed to her, but that she had never seen, because I had organized the 3 years of emails that way, had made the folder a place where the things I thought in relation to her lived without being delivered, which had seemed, at the time, like a manageable solution to the problem of having thoughts that required a recipient who had not agreed to receive them. The send happened on a Tuesday in November at 2:47 in the afternoon. I had been trying to forward a single email from the working folder to a colleague who needed context on a different project. I had right-clicked and been distracted by a phone call mid-click, and by the time I was off the phone, the dialog box was open, and I had, without reading it carefully, selected all emails in the folder and forwarded them to the address already in the to field, which was Selin's address because it was the folder of emails addressed to her. I had hit send. The phone in my hand had rung again. I had answered. 11 minutes later, I had looked at the sent folder. I had counted to 10 twice, and then I had called my friend Omar, who is the person I call when I have done something that requires an outside perspective because he is not excitable and has seen me do things that required outside perspective before and has never once made me feel worse than the process done situation itself already made me feel. Omar picked up and I said, I sent her all the emails. He said, what emails? I said, all of them. He said, how many? I said, 211. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what do they say? I said, 3 years of thinking about her, addressed to her, not intended for her to see. He said, and they went to her email. I said, at 2:47 this afternoon. He said, okay. He said it in the way he said okay when he was buying time to think and didn't want me to know he was buying time. Then he said, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know. He said, you have 2 options. You can call her immediately and explain what happened and ask her to delete them unread, and then you live with whether she actually did. Or you can wait and see if she responds. I said, what if she reads them? He said, then she reads them. I said, 3 years of emails I didn't send. He said, I know what they are. You told me about the folder. I said, I didn't know you knew about the folder. He said, you mentioned it 18 months ago. You said you had a folder. I said, I thought I was being vague. He said, "You were not being vague." I did not call her immediately. I made the decision not to call within the first 20 minutes, which was the window in which calling would have looked like a response to the send rather than a response to the reality the send had created. And I had decided that calling and asking her to delete 211 emails unread was not something I could ask with any integrity, because the unreadness was only possible if she did not read them, and her not reading them was only possible if she chose to cooperate with my desire that she not read them, which required telling her enough about what they contained to make her understand why I was asking, which would itself be a version of reading them. The logic of this had taken approximately 40 minutes to fully arrive at, during which time I sat at my desk in the city planning office in the specific quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has done something they cannot undo and is waiting to understand what they have done. She did not respond that day. She did not respond Wednesday. I went to work on Thursday morning with the specific quality of attention of someone who is holding their phone at all times without appearing to hold their phone at all times, which is a posture familiar to anyone who has sent something they cannot unsend and is waiting to understand the consequences. I had not looked at the emails in the sent folder, which required a specific act of will, because what I wanted was to read through 211 emails and understand what she was reading, or might be reading, or had already read, or had deleted unread, because I did not know. I had written them over 3 years and had not reread them in the process of writing them, and so my memory of their contents was the memory you have of things you have said in private, rather than the accurate knowledge of things you have written, which is to say that I knew the shape of them but not the specifics. I knew that they were honest and that they were 3 years long and that they had been addressed to her. Beyond that, I was working from a general sense. On Thursday evening, Omar called and asked if she had responded. I said no. He said that could mean anything. I said I knew that. He said, "You should read them." I said, "What?" He said, "You should read the emails before she responds, if she responds, because you should know what you've said before you talk to her about it." I said, "I know what I said." He said, "You wrote 211 emails over 3 years, and you're telling me you know exactly what 211 emails say." I said, "Not exactly." He said, "Read them." I got off the phone and sat down with my laptop and opened the sent folder and started with the first one, the one about the building being very good. And I read through all 211 of them in order, which took 3 hours and 14 minutes. And by the end of it, I understood, with a clarity I had not had while writing them, that what they contained was a 3-year account of loving someone who did not know they were being loved, which was both more and less embarrassing than I had expected, and which was, in its accumulated form, something that I could only read as a complete thing and wonder what she would make of it if she read it, and whether she would read it, and what would happen if she did. She responded on Friday. I was eating lunch at my desk when my phone buzzed. Her name. I looked at it for a moment. Then I opened it. The email was short. It said, "I have read some of them. I am going to need more time with the rest. I don't quite know what to say yet, but I didn't want you to think I wasn't going to say anything." She said she would write again when she had finished. She signed it with her name, no closing, just her name. I read the email 4 times. I put my lunch down. I went for a walk around the block without my coat, which I did not notice until I was outside, and the November air made the noticing unavoidable. I thought about the email, which was short and said almost nothing about what she thought of what she was reading, and which said everything about what she thought of what she was reading by saying she was going to read the rest of it and would write again when she had. I went back inside and put my coat on and returned to my desk and answered 3 work emails with a level of professional competence that I found remarkable in retrospect, and then I waited. She wrote again on Sunday. This email was longer, which I had known it would be because the first email had been the email of someone who needed time, and the second email was going to be the email of someone who had taken it. She said she had read all of them. She said it had taken her most of Saturday and some of Sunday morning. She said she was going to tell me honestly what reading them had been like, which she wanted to do because she thought I had been honest for 3 years in a way that deserved honest back, even if honest back was complicated. She said reading the first 50 or so had felt like reading someone else's mail, which she meant in the sense of reading something not intended for her, even though it was addressed to her, something private in a way that made her feel she was intruding, even though she had been sent them. She said somewhere around the middle, they had stopped feeling like someone else's mail and had started feeling like something that was in fact for her, which was a different and more complicated feeling. She said that the email in month 10, the one about what I had been thinking for the previous 10 months, had made her stop reading and make a cup of tea and sit with it for a while before she could continue, and that she had not fully been able to articulate to herself why, except that it said something she had been aware of in a different form during the project and had not known what to do with, and had put away when the project ended, thinking that was the right thing to do, thinking that what you do when something is complicated and not clearly actionable is put it away, which she now understood I had also been doing, though in a different and considerably more documented fashion. She said she was not sure what she wanted to say about all of it yet, but that she thought we should probably talk, and that she was aware that talking was what the 3 years of not talking had been building toward, and that she was not afraid of it. She just wanted to say it plainly. She thought we should probably talk. I called her that evening. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "I've been thinking about the one about the bridge." I said, "Which one about the bridge?" She said, "The one in month 4 about the rivet pattern." I said, "I took a photograph of it." She said, "I know you described the photograph." I said, "I should have sent that one." She said, "You should have sent quite a few of them." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "I wasn't certain what sending them would mean." She said, "And what does sending them mean now?" I said, "I'm working on the assumption that the accidental sending of 211 emails is a form of the universe solving a problem I couldn't solve myself." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "That is the most urban planner thing anyone has ever said to me." I said, "I've been waiting for a long time to say anything to you. I apologize if the first thing that came out was technical." She laughed, which was the first time I had heard her laugh in 28 months. And it sounded exactly the way I remembered it, and also slightly different, in the way that things you have kept in memory for 28 months are always slightly different from the reality. And I stood in my kitchen with my phone to my ear and thought that the difference between the memory and the reality was the specific evidence that she was a real person rather than an idea I had been corresponding with in private, and that the real person was considerably better than the idea. We talked for 2 hours that night, not about the emails specifically, or not only about the emails, but about the project and the time since the project and the things in the emails that were also things we could talk about directly, which turned out to be most of them. She told me about the project she had completed that had been in the journal in more detail than the journal had contained. I told her about the infrastructure project I had been working on for the past year, which was the largest project I had managed and which had specific problems that were the kind she would think about differently than anyone else I worked with, and she thought about them differently, as I had known she would, and said things that were useful in the way she had always been useful, which was by starting from outside the problem and working inward. At some point in the second hour, she said, "I think what the emails are is a record of a conversation we should have been having." I said, "I agree." She said, "You know that means we have 3 years of catching up to do." I said, "I am aware." She said, "Are you available this week?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Thursday." I said, "Thursday." We had dinner on Thursday. I had chosen a restaurant without being entirely sure it was the right choice, and it turned out to be exactly right in the way that things you have thought about for a long time occasionally are, when the thinking finally meets the reality. She arrived before me and was already at the table, which I had expected because punctuality was one of the things I had noticed about her during the project, and which the emails contained at least one observation about. She was reading something on her phone and she looked up when she saw me, and her expression was warm and slightly uncertain in a way I recognized from the project. which was the expression she had when she was in the early stages of something she did not yet fully understand. I sat down across from her and she said, "I've been reading the emails again." I said, "Which ones?" She said, "The ones from the second year." She said, "There were some I thought you might want to explain in person." I said, "Most of them." She said, "Good, we have time." We had dinner for 3 hours. She asked about specific emails, which was a form of conversation I had not anticipated, but which turned out to be exactly the right form for what we were doing, because the emails were a record, and the dinner was the conversation the record had been waiting for, and going through them together was a way of translating the private into the shared. She asked about the month 10 email. I told her what I had been thinking when I wrote it, which was that honesty in a private document is a different kind of honesty than honesty said out loud to a person, and that the month 10 email had been an attempt to be honest in a way that did not require her to respond to it, and that the accidental sending had made the response unavoidable. She said, "Do you regret the sending?" I said, "The accidental part, or the fact that they arrived?" She said, "Either." I said, "No." She said, "I'm glad." She said it the way she said most things, directly and without decoration, and I thought about 211 emails in a folder that had been a private record of 3 years of feeling something for a person who was now sitting across from me having dinner, and I thought that the folder had served its purpose in a way the folder had not been designed to serve, which was to become the beginning of the thing it had been documenting. She read the last email, the most recent one, written 2 weeks before the accidental send, at the restaurant table while I ordered the wine. She read it carefully, and then she put the phone down and she said, "You wrote this 2 weeks ago." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you weren't going to send it?" I said, "I wasn't going to send any of them." She said, "The last one says you were beginning to think the not sending was cowardice." I said, "I was beginning to think that." She said, "Were you going to do something about it?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "The universe solved it for you." I said, "I told you that on the phone." She said, "I know, I just wanted to say it again." And she picked up her wine glass, and I picked up mine. And we sat in the restaurant on Thursday evening, and I thought that 211 emails sent at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon were exactly the catastrophe I had needed, which is not the way you plan things, but is sometimes the way they have to happen, which I knew professionally from years of working on systems too complicated to plan entirely, and which I now understood personally from 3 years of writing to someone I should have written to on day 11 and didn't, and then finally did by accident, which is better than not doing it at all, which is what the alternative was. I deleted the working folder 2 days later. There was nothing left in it that needed to be there. The emails were sent and they had been read, and the reading had produced the dinner, and the dinner had produced what comes after dinner, when two people have had 3 years of correspondence they were not having and are now having it in person, which is the ongoing and specific and daily work of being known by someone and knowing them back. I still work in urban planning. She still runs her practice. The project we worked on together is finished and is very good, as I had written in the first email 11 days after it ended. Last week, she sent me a photograph of the Rivet Bridge, which I had described in the month 4 email, and which she had apparently walked past on the way to a meeting. The photograph was accompanied by a message that said, "The rivets." I sent back, "I know." She sent back, "You were right." I sent back, "I usually am about bridges." She sent back, "You were right about some other things too." I held the phone in my apartment and thought about 2:47 on a Tuesday in November and the sent folder and the 211, and I thought, yes, I was. It took 3 years and a wrong click, but yes. There are things I have thought about since the send that I want to say, because the send itself is not the most interesting part of this story, even though it is the most dramatic. The most interesting part is the folder. 3 years of emails in a folder called Working, addressed to a person who did not know they existed, written as though they were going to be sent and not sent. I have been asked by Omar, and by the version of myself that occasionally interrogates its own decisions, what the folder was for. The honest answer is that I did not know while I was filling it. I knew what each individual email was for, which was to say something I needed to say and was not ready to say, but the accumulation of 211 unsent emails over 3 years is not something I had planned. The folder was not a plan. It was what happened when I cared about something enough to write about it and did not have the specific certainty required to send what I had written. Certainty is the thing I have thought about most. Selin asked me about it at dinner, not about the folder specifically, but about what I had been waiting to be certain of. I said I had been waiting to be certain that what I felt was the kind of thing that warranted saying, rather than something that would pass or that was a projection of what I wanted, rather than a response to who she was. She said, "And were you certain?" I said, "I am now." She said, "What made you certain?" I said, "Reading 211 emails in order." She said, "You became certain of yourself by reading your own emails." I said, "It appears so." She looked at me with the expression she had used during the project when I said something that she was going to disagree with productively, and she said, "You know, that's a somewhat unusual way to arrive at self knowledge." I said, "Most of the usual ways were not working." She said, "Fair," and she went back to the menu. What I had read in the 211 emails over 3 hours and 14 minutes on Thursday evening before she responded was a record of someone learning the difference between a feeling that is real and a feeling that is consistent, which are not the same thing. The early emails had been real. They had also been the specific kind of real that is real the way things are real immediately after they happen, which is intensely and possibly temporarily. By month 6 or 7, the real had become consistent, which is its own category of real, which is the real that does not resolve itself into something else over time but continues to be exactly itself. By the end of the second year, the consistent had become something I would describe as structural, which is a word I am using in the professional sense, which is the thing that the other things depend on. I had understood, reading the emails, that what I had built in the folder was not a record of a feeling I was waiting to send, but a record of a feeling that had become load bearing, which is the technical term for something that the rest of the structure requires, and which is why removing it would require careful thought about what it was holding up. The folder is gone, the emails are sent and read. What they were holding up is now something we are building together rather than something I was building toward alone, which is the correct arrangement for something that was always going to require two people. She brought up the folder, or what had been the folder, about 2 weeks after the dinner. She said she had been thinking about the architecture of it, which was a way of thinking about things that was characteristic of her, and which I had apparently described in email 47 as one of the things I found most interesting about her, which she knew because she had read email 47. She said, "The folder was a structure with a purpose." I said, "Yes." She said, "The purpose was to keep something until it was ready." I said, "And then I sent it before it was ready." She said, "Did you?" I said, "By accident." She said, "But the accident did what the purpose was for. The thing was kept until the time it needed to arrive, and then it arrived." I said, "By accident." She said, "The fact that it was an accident is a contingent fact. The structural fact is that the thing you kept arrived when it needed to." I looked at her across the table in her apartment where we were having this conversation, and I thought about the email in month 10 and the email in month 26 and the last email 2 weeks before the send, and I thought, she is right, which is something I had written in various forms in at least a dozen of the emails, and which is still true, and which I am going to be able to say to her directly now rather than to a folder. Omar, when I told him about the dinner, said, "So the accidental send was the right thing." I said, "It was a wrong click that turned out to be the right thing." He said, "You know professionally that the difference between those two things is mostly a matter of timing." I said, "I do know that professionally." He said, "Good." He said it with the satisfaction of someone who has been saying the same thing in different forms for 3 years and has finally been understood. I said, "I should have sent the emails earlier." He said, "Probably." I said, "But I didn't." He said, "No." I said, "And it worked out." He said, "It worked out for reasons that had nothing to do with the wrong click. It worked out because of the 3 years of emails, which is what she responded to, and which existed because you wrote them." I said, I wrote them and didn't send them. He said, "You wrote them. The not sending was a separate decision that the universe overruled." I said, "That is a very specific way to interpret Tuesday afternoon." He said, "You've been writing emails to someone for 3 years and you're asking me for interpretive precision?" What is true is that the emails existed because I had been paying attention for 3 years. The paying attention was not conditional on whether the emails were sent. I had paid attention to her because she was someone worth paying attention to, and the paying attention had produced 211 emails that were a record of the attention, and the record had survived the period between the project and the send because it was honest. And the honest record had arrived in her inbox, and she had read it and had found in it, apparently, enough to be worth responding to. The wrong click was the mechanism. The mechanism was not the point. The point was the 3 years of honest attention, which is something I had always had and which she had not known she had received until Tuesday afternoon at 2:47. She sent me a photograph this morning. A building she had walked past on the way to a site visit, a 1960s office building in the city that has been in the process of being converted, which we had talked about at dinner because I knew the project professionally and she knew it architecturally, and the overlap between those two ways of knowing it had produced 45 minutes of the dinner that we had both described afterward as the best 45 minutes of the dinner, which is the kind of thing I had written about in the emails as one of the specific qualities of talking to her that made talking to her different from talking to anyone else, which I had written in email 80 something, and which I was now experiencing directly rather than recording for a folder that was no longer there. The photograph was accompanied by 3 words. They got the brick, which meant that the conversion had used brick that matched the original, which is harder and more important than it sounds, and which she had mentioned in an email to me that morning. That was the 19th email she has sent me since Friday, which is 19 emails in 2 weeks, which is the rate of emails between two people who are talking, and not the rate of emails going into a folder that is not being read. The rate is better. Everything about the direct version is better than the documented version, which I had suspected and which has been confirmed empirically over the past 2 weeks. I sent back, "Of course they did." She sent back, "They almost used a different brick." I sent back, "I know, I was in the meeting." She sent back, "I forgot you were in the meeting." I sent back, "I'm in most of the meetings." She sent back, "That explains some of the emails." I sent back, "Yes." She sent back, "The meetings were useful." I sent back, "The meetings were the best part of the project." She sent back, "Not the only best part." I held my phone in my apartment on a Friday morning and thought about 2:47 on a Tuesday in November, and a wrong click and a sent folder, and 211 emails that had been in a folder called Working for 3 years, because that is what they had been working towards something. And I thought that the folder had earned its name and that the work was done and that what came after the work was what the work was for, which is the building you end up with when you have paid attention long enough, and which is, as I had written in the first email 11 days after the project ended, going to be very good.